Good morning, everybody. Probably going to have to do some mask foos. There's lots of people around, and I'm beginning the video in the more populated parts of the garden this morning. Give you a little quick panorama. Don't know if you can see the blue heron down on the little island in the pond. There's some old Dawn redwood. The golden tree across the pond is Meta Sequoia glyptostroboides in the Latinate taxonomy. Some cypresses and a number of old eucalyptus trees around here, old for eucalyptus anyway. This is one of my this is one of the most majestic trees in the garden. I have a private name for it. I have a number of things on my mind this morning. Questions and inspirations and excitements. Though I probably sound relatively calm. There's a special kind of silence in the garden that changes at different times of day. The quality of the silence. What the silence transmits or delivers.
So she established goodwill with them over a number of months. And then I guess
It's wonderful to hear the little, we call them snatches, which is an interesting euphemism, but little pieces of conversation. Isn't it strange and beautiful how slight change of perspective from the point of view radically alters the near terrain, and as things grow more distant, they are more stable from the point of view. So that you can move the point of view and the distant things don't move much. Now imagine for a moment the opposite situation. A situation where the point of view, though embodied locally, moves its point of origin very far away. And by the way, get your imaginations ready because we're going to be doing a lot of imagining today. if I move my origin point, right, from within my body too far away, then if I move my origin point, like let's say my wrist is the origin point, right? I can move the wrist a little bit, but the farther away thing moves a lot, yeah? Comparatively to what's happening right there at the wrist. Yeah? Little movement nearby, huge movement far away. So imagine if you could move your origin point 1 light year away, and just move your perspective a millimeter, right? How far would your origin point travel? Very far. But if you moved it hundreds of light years away or thousands of light years away, and you moved a millimeter here, you might traverse a light year out there instantly, not in a year. And this thing might seem a playful thought experiment. And it's reasonable in our modern ways of thinking to dismiss it, right? Say, well, you can't move your origin point light years away. But who is saying you can't? Stranger things than this are certainly true, right? Things we've managed to learn through scientific inquiries. Even though we, as a species and as bodies of researchers, only very slightly understand the principles and relationships that we study. Partly because we kind of don't know the first thing. We don't know the idea or the model that is true enough, is truthful enough, that all other models should inherit their qualities from it. It's kind of like not knowing who your dad is, right? We sort of don't know the meaning progenitor of the universe. Or progenitors, right? Because I don't just have a dad, I have a mom. And ancient peoples had to grapple, except I think that's the wrong word, because we have to grapple. They didn't really have to grapple. They were in some ways more sensible in both senses of this word, right? They were more sensible in that they couldn't be convinced of abstract nonsense. Which this astonishing being here is a living refutation of, right? I'm sure they're completely convinced by this tree. Yeah. Though it would be surprising to me if for them the tree inhabited primarily the class of objects, things. Very unlikely. Because back then, things were rare and beings were everywhere. So things were something very clearly fashioned by persons. And I think during the fashioning, it was understood that an aspect of the essence of the person is transferred into the object. And we can say, well, that's mere superstition, and in an age where machines make objects, that seems very realistic to me. That mostly matches our experience. But everyone has an experience of having heard a song or seen a painting, particularly having heard a song in the presence of the one who makes it, or created it, invented it, and similarly an original painting, looking at the actual canvas that a painter transformed. It would be very difficult to argue whether we believe in metaphysics or not, either way, that there's nothing of the essence, the unique, momentarily existing yet, spanning over time, both things, essence of the creators. Yeah? And even in our tools, the essence is there, but it's there at the class level rather than the instance level. So, for example, if we take pliers, right? The essence of the engineers who invented and transformed the class over time is in there. But individual pliers only, it is present in individual pliers sort of only at the layer of structure, form. So, when an ancient person made a pot, or a vase, or a vase, as some others say, they were merging two lines of development, right? The class line, we make pots, there are pots, we have vases, and the instance. And they could slightly transform both, right? A potter, right? They could make their imprint also on the class, right? What kind of vase is this? What is its shape? What features does it have? What features will I embody in it? And then, like the painter in the decorative surface of the vase, again, the same thing. There's a traditional thread, right? And there's the personal contribution. It's very beautiful and complex, this thing. And it's a useful perspective to see that when we pay attention closely to something and we become deeply engaged, we're not just engaging with ourselves or the clay in the case of the potter, but anciently conserved traditions are drawn in, and unique personal transformations and developments, concerns and enchantments, right? Become involved as we craft the vase. Open at one end, closed on the other. The closed end sits on the side of gravity, right? The opened end sits on the side of potential. It's probably natural to think that what we put inside the vase doesn't transform it, because to all outward appearances, it's still the same thing. It still has the same designs on the outside, it's still in the same position, theoretically, same shape, same history, except not. We might not be able to see what's inside it, but the union of the vase and the content is different, whether we decide to admit this perspective or not. It seems to me. The vase. how much stranger is our language than our physical artifacts, right? For these things that I'm reflecting on are all similar when we make language. And there's all different kinds of ways and reasons to make it, all different kinds of purposes or ways of being in making language. But I remember thinking this morning, as I was walking along, that there are ways in which our communications would improve dramatically if we made very clear facial and body language and just emitted noises that were non-linguistic. Oh, yeah, mom, yeah. Something like that. I was thinking, of course, there'd be billions of ways of making non-linguistic noises. But I was thinking, I think something in me, anyway, and I won't speak for other people on an idea this seemingly strange, would respond very well to that and feel nourished and recognized, right? The non-verbal aspect of my being that is never captured in language, but language is constantly talking about it. See, it's happening right now. I'm using language to talk about the aspects of my being that aren't really very, let's say they don't feel recognized or enacted by language. There's a red tail over there on the ground. You see, we just witnessed something that's unrepresented. Well, we're witnessing it in a video. I witnessed something that was unrepresented, though I was representing it by recording it. The before of language. The feelings and imaginal connotations of seeing the bird flying, the little bird chasing it, the other birds singing, foggy sky, living garden. But I was thinking, our faces, they're unimaginably flexible, right? They're wonderful devices, not devices, they're wonderful transports for communication, recognition, play, discovery, wonder, awe. And I wouldn't want to get rid of our verbal languages, but I think they would transform if we had this other thing. And of course we have some other stuff, but there's a bunch of problems with it because we're sort of trapped in this very narrow, thin layer of modernity that deprives us of just about, well, most of the really profoundly beautiful and useful opportunities of our humanity are at best occluded, if not amputated or punished, right? And when I say most, I really mean it. I'm talking 90% of what it means to be human is completely unavailable to nearly all of us most of the time. It doesn't mean that it's inaccessible from our weird position within the layer of modernity. It means that, it's always accessible in theory, but actually accessing it is really difficult from within the worldview of our modernity. And so we may need some useful help, some assistance in getting outside of that thin layer of ideas. Concepts, identity models, right? What is this? What is that? What does this do? What does that do? I think a long time ago, instead of what is this? What does that do? It was, who are these? What can we become together? See how different that is? Like, first of all, instead of the megalomaniacal model where the humans or the human is a god manipulating objects at whim with no necessity of intimacy or relation other than with the task at hand. What a trope. The task at hand. So instead of being sort of overpowered, self-presumedly magnificent, self-presumedly advanced manipulators of things, the relational space becomes one of being together with and for each other. And that's a pivot of worldviews, right? We are makers, we do the things, largely without concern about, usually after having defected from nature entirely, conceptually, right? In other words, just seeing it as resources to make more things, for whatever whim we may entertain, many of them bizarre, omnicidal, insane, completely wrong-minded, too dangerous to contemplate. We are there. The atomic bomb, too dangerous to contemplate. We are right there. Right? Social networks, too dangerous to contemplate. We are on it. Governmental response to pandemics, no one has it. Yeah, we are there. Boom. Right? Too dangerous to contemplate, and we're doing it. We have a story about how living beings acquire and evince properties and qualities and functions over time, and call it evolution. And there are aspects of it that seem to be concrete facts and are reasonably worth understanding as such. But whether or not we project those facts over the whole field of concern is a very important question. And that's what usually happens. We don't have any understanding of the fundamental basis, so we presume that the understanding we have is the fundamental basis, right? We replace the unknown and its vast diversity and dimensionality with the known. And this is one of the central nightmares of modern human thought, because as we replace that ambiguity, we depart from relation with the mysteries that invite us into actual relationship. If you cut off all the mysteries, then relationship, you amputate them, becomes transactions. And transactions, while superficially seemingly important and useful, and they're not unimportant, if they come to dominate the field, our essence becomes kind of husk-like, dried out. There's no vitality in there, because There's no place for transfer in relation of essence. Now earlier I was asking you to imagine, and it's a really simple idea, that if I move my perspective many light years away, for example, let's just say I pick a random star in the sky and I look at it, yeah? And then I simply move my gaze to another star in the sky. Can you understand that the intervals traversed by my vision if we place the point of origin at the objects in my vision, right? I'll call them, they aren't objects actually, stars. See, this is another problem. We place things in subclasses that belong in superclasses, and stars are one of them, because without stars there are no classes. There are no minds, no languages, no religions, no science, right? So that's not an ordinary thing, right? Life forms and science and models of time and light and force only emerge as a bizarre side effect of there being a star nearby, right? So it's almost as if the star is expressing itself, and time-space is expressing itself, and the history of this particular little family of orbital objects is expressing itself in all of the forms and relationships and results of living beings on Earth. And that's pretty astonishing. We rarely stop to consider how profound well, no, it's not even, see, this is part of why we don't consider it. It's not a profound influence. The sun doesn't have a profound influence on life. No sun, no life. Like no Darren, no Darren's hand, right? It's that kind of relationship. You might say, well, there are still other hands. Sure, but there aren't this hand. And this is the hand that I'm pretty intimately concerned with, since it's mine. Well, I am associated with it, let's put it that way, deeply. So if I look at the star and I just switch my vision to another star, you'll notice that, like, down here on Earth, my eyes are traversing an interval, right? And down here, that interval is really tiny. But what they're touching is very strange. If we draw a line from my eye to the first star, it could be, I don't know, hundreds of light years away. Yeah? And then as I move my vision to the second star, two new variables emerge. The distance from my eye to the first object changes, right? Because now I'm looking at the second object, and that could have a completely different distance. It could be vastly farther away or vastly closer to my eye. But I also traverse the distance between those two stars. And that distance is weird because it looks in the sky like they're associated, but we can't see right? We can't see the twist. We can't see the turn, so we can't really tell, oh, that star is in a completely different direction from this star, and right, there's a very complex manifold of distances traversed if I just make this move with my eye. So we would say that distant things can touch our vision, but I think it's important to realize our vision can touch distant things. We usually think of vision as fundamentally receptive. I strongly suspect it cannot merely be this way. So imagine that it's not. Imagine that our vision touches it contacts in some way all that we see. And so some aspect of us is traversing those distances, traveling. There is a way to move the point of origin of perception. There's more than one way. And the results are very astonishing. And moderns in general would not believe them unless they directly experience them. And even after directly experiencing them, they would be extremely puzzled, because if they were to admit the results of such an experiment or experience, it would destroy the foundations of everything else they have ever known about anything. And the reason it would do that is that it would change the root meaning of identity in a way that has to do with travel, communion, going apart and coming together, orbital relationships, watch a child and his mom or a dog and its owner. There are weird principles that we can, like sort of fundamental principles of relation that are relatively obvious, and the periodicity of orbital nearness to a relational companion is a blatantly obvious one, right? How close do we orbit? Do we go far away and then come back really close? Do we stay really close? Do we have an eccentric orbit, right, where we come close then go far away? Do the angles change in the orbit? All of these things, right? Our families are little orbit, can be understood. It's a beautiful frame. It's a useful frame, right? I'm not saying it is this way. Yet it's, I mean, you look at the solar system. I think there's something going on in dimensions we don't see, right? Because I am aware from experience that our ordinary access to dimensionality, we have a flatland problem. In the sense that there are what we would reasonably refer to as dimensions interacting with ours intimately, moment to moment, that we are connected with, that transform us and we transform them, that are invisible to our thought because we don't have concepts about them yet, and they're ordinarily invisible to our experience primarily because we're buried in nonsense. They're not invisible to the experience of children, though each child, has a unique relationship with the great mystery of being, right? And all of the appearances within this great mystery, and their histories and transformations, their behaviors, what they do. But each child has not yet acquired, or is still in the process of acquiring, this really narrow modern mind layer. Yeah, this very conceptual, abstract, think in generalities, think about averages, think about norms, project norms over the field, collapse the field to points, collapse the manifold to fields, collapse the field to a plane, collapse the plane to a graph, collapse the graph to a point. Think of the point as the entire field so that the whole diversity disappears, right? This stuff is just mind-wrecking. And it's the everyday, flavor of the media and the contexts that we are generally engaged in. And one of the reasons why I come here in an attempt to be refreshed and renewed and to recognize and be recognized by again, we have no class we have no class that contains a member like this, so I don't know how to refer to what I'm being recognized by in regular language. In technical language, it would be something like, the beings who are my ancient family and embody and exist and express a biorelational hyperstructure that supervenes over time, right? It's above time. It has embodiment down here in time. It's doing all things in time, stuff in time, but its being is outside of time. And I wouldn't want to call it a god, but that's the closest class we have. And it's kind of crummy. It's not good. So we need some kind of new frame. A frame that can originate minds. Yeah? A frame that the existence of this class, if we're talking lexically, is known to express itself in beings and minds throughout time, but from outside of time. And it's a wonderful experience to be recognized by something, because I am its body and it is my body, and it's in time and outside of time, and you can travel in this network. I think our minds are made for that, actually, not for all the things we do with them. Yeah, well, you know, I was listening to Richard Feynman, and he was talking about his father and how his father really encouraged him to use his imagination to go like way past what the humans have done. Go outside what the humans have done. Suppose, for example, that you come from another world. Your world has an extremely advanced, sort of actually advanced intelligence perspective, right? And they come and look at the questions in you, as you. They come and, you know, play and explore in the world of humans. But they think like they're from another universe, because they are. And they're still human. So it's as if, essentially Feynman's dad was saying something, he wouldn't state it this clearly, but for all intents and purposes, you are an alien from time-space. Right? You're carrying assets from time-space that are incredibly more sophisticated than anything the humans are playing with and have played with. So don't start and stop within the little narrow band of human activity. Chase the big questions with your imagination, with wonder, with awe, with reverence, with enthusiasm. If it is, you know, your nature to enjoy such pursuits, which of course, for Feynman, is almost nothing better. So our imaginations are fundamentally important, and they're part of what gets crushed by the very modern layer. You can see this happening as children grow up, right? You can see them, with some exceptions, with some very important exceptions, and many of them, but according to the general pool, not enough. But most of the children, they'll lose their imagination. They'll stop imaginally playing as they get older. For many of them, sometime between, I don't know, 9 and 15, the first wave of that process will sort of pulse through their cognition. But you can see the children's fascination collapsing toward functions, objects, transactions, just like their parents have done. And this is very tragic, and we should pay close attention, because we do not grow out of our imagination. It's a cultural problem. It's a conceptual linguistic problem. It's a contextual problem. We naturally mimic and are inclined toward recapitulating the cultures we find ourselves in and the behaviors and concerns that are popular. Obviously, because those behaviors are rewarded and others are punished or go unnoticed, right? But Feynman's father was trying to explain to him something that I think Feynman took very deeply to heart, which was that the metrics by which intelligence and human minds and beings are ordinarily measured in their own systems are bullshit. So go outside the systems, go beyond. Start beyond them. You can include little pieces of them or whole segments of knowledge if you want, but start above it, right? Because that's your natural, it is your nature, it is in accord with your nature that your mind, at least partly in important aspects, supervenes over knowledge and language and ideas. And because if it doesn't, then it collapses into the structure of its tools, and that's not habitable, and the imagination dies in there. If it collapses. Now, the imagination can play with tools in wonderful ways, right? As we've seen craftsmen, artists, musicians, even actors, although the tools of the actor are not precisely physical. And if we begin to think as beings who come from time-space and are native to Earth, now things change very strangely for the meaning of identity and also our access to intelligence, because it is not only by experiment that we learn. We learn also by relation. And someone can say, well, relation's experimental. Is it? Really? Because I think before the advent of science a few hundred years ago, science as we know it, these two things were reasonably considered distinct. Experiment and relation. Though we perform something resembling experiments in relationships. We make as if gestures, right? We invent, we collaborate, hopefully. The fundamental ideas that we're exposed to in life first, but that are taken up from our experience and existence by disciplines such as physics. It's a great mountain of dirt. That must be a blast. I remember playing as a child on large piles of dirt and how incredible it was. Of course, it'd be unlikely that I've had that experience without, bulldozers and things, it seems. I've spoken of this before, although it's been on my mind a lot lately, past few days. I should return to the previous topic. So, I think Feynman's father was saying, imagine you're an explorer from time-space, and you've landed on Earth, and you're inside a human form, but you come from up there. And your home is up there, and your people are up there, and everything's up there. But it's all also, everything that's up there, with very few exceptions, can be found embodied, sort of encrypted, if you will, in form nearby. So, walk in the world relating with the deepest questions about time, light, origin, organisms, consciousness, dreaming, love, wonder, awe, reverence, enchantment, hatred, war, disease, technology, mathematics, language, art, children, trees, raccoons, bees, oceans, whales. As if you've been transported into a living library of all of the beings and relationships and families and histories and knowledge and intelligence of time-space, right where you are, so that there's really no position you can't reach from inside your little human body encapsulated in physical reality on planet Earth. All places in time and space are accessible from here. Now, it sounds like a crazy science fiction story, and various science fiction stories have been written about it. One that comes to mind is The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester, in which a man learns that he can teleport under conditions of extremely profound stress. For example, the threat of incipient extinction. And one of the reasons why I'm telling these stories in this way is because a long time ago they were told to me, or they were shown to me, I experienced them, with another being, that it's really difficult for me to imagine as having been human, or even being an embodied being in the ways we would ordinarily think about it. And we had many long conversations, except that their version of language causes the experience to happen in you as if you've had the experience the language refers to, instead of referring to it. There's no way to do something like that in English. And the closest ways are kind of silly. Well, it's not entirely true. Language can be used to draw us into trance. That's an interesting feature. And language can also be used to shock and or terrify us. I don't like that feature as much, but it's interesting. Because it's not an ordinary linguistic everyday experience. Well, for most of us. For some of us it is. For some of us language becomes a terrifying opponent of our intelligence and awareness. For some of us, our minds collapse into language. And thus language tells us what it means. And we can see the association of this with a variety of the species of psychosis and schizophrenias and such. So when I was making the little toy about moving the point of origin from perspective, the humans always think that it's important to travel physically. But if there's a network that allows non-physical travel, trust me, you'd prefer it. And you'd be very happy being here on Earth and being able to experience other minds, other worlds, other situations without having to physically go there, which would be both expensive and dangerous and all kinds of strange things. There probably are accessible transports for something resembling instantaneous physical travel. I have good reason to suspect they're mostly unused, except by very dangerous collectives. Right? But my point is really to try and return some of the inherent nature and diversity and intelligence and aspects of origin and being and identity that are inherently associated with our humanity, but are ejected by our definitions. We think we know what humans are. Now, if we knew what humans were, then many of the things that humans do that are far outside the norms look impossible to us, like the magician who learns to hold his breath for 20 minutes. Right? Or the guy who learns to free dive to 180 feet and hang out down there. Or the martial artist that can put her finger through, a millimeter of iron. The person who climbs the snowy mountain naked. The person who invents hypnosis, right? Or discovers it and, the minds that contribute to mathematics. From the normalized perspective of human thought, from our common trap in the thin layer of modern ideas, that of course is very sophisticated in certain dimensions, like technological dimensions, mathematical dimensions, economic dimensions, but knows nothing of, it doesn't know the first thing about the first thing. Right? We can do all this stuff in a kind of fictionalized overlay, a layer, a blanket, on top of everything that's truly meaningful and human. And we can become very confused as generations upon generations re-ramify the thinness and compression of that layer that that nearly everyone will live in throughout their entire lives, and the wars and the disease and the lost opportunity for living meaningful lives as human beings together, which, this reminds me of another problem I had earlier. I was thinking about the United States, and the goal wasn't something like a vast population of despotic, luxury-addicted imbeciles projecting their dominant greatness over mankind and the rest of the world. That was not the fucking goal. The goal wasn't a technological nightmare that eats the ecologies of the planet and snuffs human cognition in the process. Right? No, that wasn't the goal. The goal was something like the liberty to explore and develop the finest and most noble assets of our potential as human beings, as individuals and as collectives, both. That was the promise that I associate with the urge to form this nation. Now, each individual who was involved had arrays of purposes, but there was a spirit underlying this, and the spirit of liberty is not about freedom to do everything you want to do or anything that can be done. In fact, that's not liberty. Like, there are problems with really general words like liberty, and one of them is that an unstructured liberty encodes a flaw with the potential to incline us to self-terminating games that wipe them and their players out, and other players too. Is that really liberty? It just depends on how general we are or what we mean by it. But if we mean the first thing that I was saying, if we mean the nurtured, supported opportunity to discover what it means and can become to be human in an intelligent, creative, heartful culture, this has been the dream of our ancestors in every generation. And some of them lived in such cultures even though they were technologically and conceptually, or techno-conceptually, young, youthful, naive. Yeah, they were techno-conceptually naive. This is not the same as conceptually naive. Right? They were not conceptually naive. In fact, all the evidence points to the opposite. They were relationally conceptually, rather than techno-conceptually, they were relationally conceptually very advanced. And their languages were wildly different from English. And I think they knew, many of them, a simple idea, or they conserved a fundamental principle in their thought, that we come from the sky. And so there's one home for all beings, one origin for all beings. There's no way there's two. It doesn't matter if you're rational or not, right? You can be rational about it, there's no way there's two. The spiders, one of the things they do is go fishing with a strand of web, sometimes with a little kite of some sort on the end, a little piece of a leaf or a stick, right? And they'll lower that down, or they'll produce silk, yeah, what we call silk. Wonder what the spiders call it. I'd love to know the answer to that question, actually. Maybe each spider has a different idea, name for it, or maybe... See, this is the thing. Spiders probably don't call it something, and yet they have the precursors to what we make language out of, I think. And under the right conditions, one could learn what a spider calls it, even though the spider's a non-linguistic organism, right? This is the weirdness of our actual situation. Rationally, this makes no sense. So if you're rational, you can't do this. It's not possible. Or you're just making things up. Right? But there isn't anything but just making things up. The speed of light is something we made up. It's a measurement, but all the concepts that surround it in the math and all that kind of thing, we made that up. And in fact, we made up the idea that it's a speed. And I don't think it's a speed. And as, a guy from the sky down here really curious about everything that's going on in physical reality, and I am, I don't think light is traveling. I don't know what it's doing, but the idea of travel just doesn't seem the right thing to me. It's got some really peculiar relationship with time. And that relationship may be expressed in E equals mc squared to a degree, but that's not the only expression of that relationship. So yeah, from the perspective outside of humanity, from the perspective outside the very narrow layer of our modern conceptual thought, for all of its abundant capacity to be informative if we can relate with it intelligently, that's the difficult part. Because it changes what we see with, and so we start seeing like the tools we use. We tend to, our computers and smartphones change our minds to work more like our computers and smartphones, rather than us changing our computers and smartphones to work more like our minds and not interfere with some of their crucial foundations, right? As unfortunately our technologies tend to do. Where they don't do something else, they're pretty much doing that. Now I was wanting to talk some about temporalities, but I'm probably not going to get there. I've got at least two other things on my plan. So the first is just to talk briefly about the fact that our minds and our bodies are these incredibly, if you could compress the quality of intelligence and then embody it at different scales, right? The virus, the cell, the bacterium, the organ, the circulatory system, the nervous system, muscle system, the fascia, the sort of liquidy connecting systems throughout the body that science is just discovering or just starting to think about, distinguishing. It's layered. And sort of way up near the top of that, you've got cognition, right? It's like an emergent, we can think of it as an emergent property of the complexities, the inconceivable. The activity of a single cell is inconceivable over a second. There's no way we could possibly track all of it ever with all the computation. Right. Now, of course, it depends on the scale. If you say well, can we track it all at the molecular level? Conceivably. However, pretty difficult to have a clear simulation of the structural transformations within the cell's interiority. But my point is just that there are complexities so profound that although we can learn things about, we can learn to distinguish elements within them and relationships and processes within them, it's very difficult to get any kind of reasonable grasp on the unity of the incredible profusion of relationships that even is going on in a liver. I mean, never mind, a slug, which we think of, and we say this in English, we often refer to animals and insects derisively, right? Like a mere ant. It's so ridiculous. Because nature's so strange that she uses something resembling compression in sizes of discrete organisms. And there's different levels of compression in different organisms and different modes. And compression of what? History, lineage, intelligence, genes. Sure, genes are in there, but they're not the only thing going on by a long shot. That would be like thinking cars are what there are, right? And overlooking humans, right? We see a lot of cars on Earth. Earth is about cars. It wouldn't be a difficult, they would think like the cars make these little meat things that run around and make more cars. And by the way, this is thinking like an alien. This is what Feynman's father was partly encouraging, although I think his father was a very sophisticated intelligence, to put it mildly. And Feynman's intelligence, because his father set the first rung of the ladder above the narrow human thing, right, and helped his son set it there. Feynman was like a superhero among human beings because he operated outside the conceptual foundations that all of the other humans found ordinary, expectable, normal. And so he was constantly able to just blow people's minds with some, for him, usually either relatively simple or extremely clever trick, right? He liked, in a way, he was a bit of a magician, but he was more interested in imagination and thought than he was in props, for good reason. The toy he came up with about determining the vectors of quantum phenomenon is unimaginably brilliant, and he doesn't know how he came up with it. But I think it's in QED, his book on quantum electrodynamics, that I've read a few times with astonishment, because this is an instance where it really looks like somebody was an alien, right? It's like they come up with something that looks like alien code about quantum transformations that any normal human being without very significant mathematical knowledge can perform, right? But that's the kind of stuff we are fully capable of doing, and we're capable of doing it in all kinds of places, relationally, not just technologically, right? So Feynman's father was trying to ensure that his son didn't adopt a cripplingly narrow, circa 19 whatever, 40, 30 worldview. And Feynman's a scientist. I think he would say, he'd probably say he's a human being first, but he would certainly claim to be very deeply interested in the capacity for analysis to result in insight. Something like this, yeah. But it wasn't mere analysis with Feynman. Thankfully. We got lucky with that guy. There are many great minds who realized that they're not merely human. And this is what I'm hoping to communicate. We are fully human, but we are not merely human. And our world is I believe, in its actual nature and activity and being and form, so dimensionally deep, so rich, so profound, that the idea of gods is rendered relatively trivial by what's actually going on. Over the developmental history of our species, the layers became stratified, and our felt sense of being in the world was pressed, from their core. Some was taken and pressed into the next layer, and from the core, less was taken and pressed into the next layer, where we then dwell. And from our core, even less was taken and then pressed into the more modern layer, where we then dwell. And so we have no real, our access to our core in waking life is normally very limited. There are all kinds of play we can engage in that transform that, and that return some of the possibilities of our humanity to us. And I think we are reasonably concerned that there are also various forms of extremely contagious nonsense that we don't want any part of, really. Now, some of that nonsense is progenerative of useful insight and growth and awareness, learning. But some of it is just like a very special trap in the narrow layer knows it's narrow, so it makes little traps inside it that look like escape vectors but are actually just prisons, right? We do this. Although, I don't command the oxygen on Earth. It is not at my disposal. Though I think I could wreck it if I wanted to. Thankfully, I don't. And similarly, we imagine that we are the keepers of our minds, but our minds are being kept by other things. And whether or not those things have intrinsic being-like qualities so that our minds are inhabited by something like angels and demons, we could name them differently. They'd still amount to pretty much the same thing. You'd have the bad, infective, mind-making stuff, and the good, not as contagious mind-making stuff. Or beings, right? And it looks a bit like this to me, right? It does. It looks like something. We cooperate with a variety of originary forces and conserved structural traditions and so on and so forth in mind making. And ordinarily, we think, oh, I have a mind, so I don't have to make one. But no, it's not true. It's more like a recipe. It's more like a cooking project, right? You want to chase a certain experience or outcome or a kind of growth or insight, then you have to compose a mind capable of doing that. And the primary faculty with which this composition takes place, imagination. In fact, if there are other faculties, all of the other faculties seem to be composed out of collapsed imagination into structure, right? So, I don't know. So that layeredness is really interesting, and you can see, like even in this tree, there's a map of time. The bottom of the tree, probably the oldest time. The roots of the tree, the invisible roots, the oldest time. The top of the tree, the newest time. And it spreads out in branches and becomes more diverse as it complexifies. Well, the problem with humans is we're spreading and diversifying in into traditionally posed abstractions and transactions that replace relationships, insight, presence in the game, skin in the game, intelligence, concern, intuition. Yeah. And so these are fake branches and they're eating the tree of our minds. Right? The trunk is being chunks of the trunk are being exported, right? And we're getting all this apparent progress structure shit on the top, except most of it's lethal. So I don't think you'll find any tree who, as it grows, starts attacking its own trunk with the upper branches to destroy the trunk. But that's how human cognition is acting presently in the cognitium of humans and in the biorelational hyperstructure of the planet, which is, in case it isn't clear, the trunk. Right? That's where we get intelligence from. There wasn't ever any other place to get it. This is the only place there is for us to have it or to be. So, really weird idea. Yet, absolutely prevalent, just as prevalent as in a terrifying science fiction story, where evil monsters from Universe X, in this case humans, come to destroy everything, right? Including themselves apparently. They're that bent on, and it's not because their essence is this way. It's because the character of the upper layer, the character of the modern layer in which they're mostly trapped, is omnicidal. It's like a patient who's had a stroke on the right hemisphere of their brain, right? And they just see manipulables, and when those things refuse to be manipulated in the way they like, they want them destroyed. And it's really bizarre that humans could ever develop in such a direction that they became abiotic, right? Their primary concerns were divesting places and their own bodies of life and diversity. Huh? But that is the time in which we live, en masse. And there isn't any intelligent collective, right? It really is like a couple of drunk teenagers got a hold of the family fortune while the parents were out of town and burnt the fucking, not just the house, but the whole maybe they set the city on fire, right? And died in the process. And then the parents come home and they're like, what the? So there's this weird way in which we're missing something. And one way to understand this something is simply we're not present in the living places and relationships in the way that we need to be corrected, you know, by that relation. But it's like an old story where very intelligent parents leave their children on an island. They have to, for some reason. And they can't stay with them on the island, perhaps because they're not physical. And they know that on the island the children will forget everything about their home and their family and intelligence and such. And they leave them with some special gifts that have the power to reawaken those memories initially, because they're very concerned that their children will forget who they are. In the sense of their most fundamental the essences of their origin, their relational intimacies with being in origin, as origin, their potentials for profound, miraculous transformation and growth and learning and insight, healing. It's as if the parents disappeared, and then over time, the little things they left us, and this is one of them, we forgot how to follow them back to the memories from before. And yet, within each of us, there is this weird thing, a kind of a heart compass, right? That we feel like, yes, this here, this is good. And, yes, this over here, not so much of that, or no, right? There's a compass. And that compass is important in mind forming, right? In what I call psygenesis, which we've been playing with today, because I'm forming mind about forming mind. Not so much intentionally. So if we sink down in the layers, and part of that happens immediately when we dream, boom, now we're in like an older, lower layer that's more connected with the layers beneath it, which the modern little narrow shell-like crust is not, and resists, right? That crust actively resists the intrusion of nourishment and informingness, from lower layers, right? From the old stuff. And that old stuff is really rich, really deep, really profound, and that's where most of our humanity is hidden. It's very easy to see when you encounter, for example, somebody who's extremely skillful, usually and often a very old man. The old man is muscularly weak, right? Feel his arms just flabby flop in there, right? But then he just touches you like this and your body falls over. And there's no possible way you can duplicate that thing. There's no like secret he can teach you where suddenly now you can do this too. At least that's very unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. It's next to impossible. And this is because this old man has spent his life understanding in his interior, inside his body, and doing things inside his body that other people do with the outside of their body. And most people would say, well, that's nonsensical. You can't do things inside your body. Yes, actually you can. And the reason they think it's nonsensical, that's just the crust defending itself, right? Well, that's just bullshit. I've never seen anything like that. You haven't seen most of what's going on. So the fact that you've never seen anything like that does not entitle you to dismiss it as nonsense. Now, there are occasionally useful purposes for dismissing something in that way. But we should be very cautious in transferring our ideas about the norms of humanity to the nature of humanity, because the nature of humanity is not expressed in the norms, right? Or rather, a kind of least common factor, right? Least meaning less diverse, less rich, less deep, less dimensional. A least common factor is expressed in norms. But we should never project that over the field of humans, because the opposite is what we should do. We should take the exemplars of astonishing, miraculous superfunction, what seems to us to be superfunction, and understand this is the nature of humanity. The nature of humanity is in radically exceeding all possible expectation, or even things we could have previously imagined, and then becoming those things together, and hopefully for purposes that are noble and true and beautiful, and would be shared with all of the life on earth, right? We have the capacity to accomplish things so astonishingly beautiful and miraculous that life on earth itself would be not merely celebrated, but the dreams of the ancient nurseries of life would find fulfillment, right? Suddenly the suffering and illness and predation and disease and beauty and wonder and awe would have been for something meaningful, and that would change everything on earth. Everything feels when something like this happens, right? The whole bell of the living beings of earth, it just resonates with a kind of a developmental frisson, right? That feeling of tingling all over, yeah? And our people have the capacity to become this. Yeah? Yet we primarily, as en masse, become the opposite of this. We're pissing on the history of the suffering and dreams and wonder and awe and gifts of life on earth. We're pissing on that, laughing, turning up the stereo, buying the 9,000 fucking, buying the 9,000 ton truck, right? Buying the truck that spits out black smoke and just, fuck you, and there's no environment, and, this kind of shit, right? I don't know how many pounds the truck is. A big number of pounds. It's tragic. It's wrong. We can't live like this. I can't live like this. This is miserable. And I know the other feeling because I've experienced it. I've experienced it when one human being or a small group of human beings, they do something so beautiful and true to our essence and our heart and our nature and to the heart of the sky and to the heart of the world and the heart of the sun, that the whole world just lights up and goes like, amazing. You know, our children, it was worth it. It was worth everything we suffered. But when we do the opposite, the toxicity and tragedy of that is inconceivable, yet feelable. And it matters, these things. They matter in the, well, many people do not think in such terms. They don't realize, even if you limit it to humans, right? Our ancestors worked for dreams. And we have the luxury, or we have had anyway, it's probably going away for a bit, maybe permanently. But we've had the luxury of being able to fulfill those dreams, but the dreams we've fulfilled are mostly dark and grim and nightmares, really. We've fulfilled the nightmares of the dreaming our ancestors' lives were made of. It's very sad. And you know, there's levels, right? There's like the individual level. Occasionally I have an opportunity, or I'm able to compose an opportunity to do something beautiful, to be someone beautiful. And I want that. That's the path that I really desire. But other desires contest with it, and other injuries and confusions contest with it. And our species is much like this. In the sense of they're not dissimilar to one great big individual in a million bodies, or billions of bodies. So I wanted to just sort of play with the idea that as we can sink down from the crust layer of modernity toward the origins of and the minds of our ancestors, because we contain them. Yeah. We can go looking for them in archaeological digs and research and so on. And I don't recommend that we don't do any of that necessarily, though I could under some circumstances. But the inner archaeology that we can do is really profound and leads all the way back to the first thing. Or to the origin. It's not a thing back there. There is no first thing. That's just weird English language. Alright, so the layers. And from outer space. If I want to open the senses that in my waking life ordinarily are occluded or blocked, there's different paths I can traverse toward that goal. One of them is to quiet my thinking mind. Just let it slow down. And maybe with a little diaphanous puff, it disappears. And then there's silence in my mind. And then I begin to often in nature, I begin to see things with my eyes that just a moment ago were invisible. Oh yeah. And then I begin to learn things that are of a different kind from the activity of my mind, usually. And these feel often like experiences of insight, and I enjoy that. I can form a mind to chase a question in a specific place, or even to go to a place and look for a question, right? To discover a question in the place where I may pursue it. And often this is a question related to living beings and living places. I can move from my intellect into my heart. That's a very profound thing. It can be difficult to do because I think I feel vulnerable in the modern crust is not particularly friendly to heartful, anything other than sort of superficially heartful stuff. There are many ways that I can redirect my psygenesis, but it requires that I begin with an intention resembling that, right? I want to form my mind anew. So please bear in mind that your mind is not a possession. It's something you are making. And if you make different minds, you get different assets and vulnerabilities. And we can make really amazing minds together when we recall this, and when we can lift each other out of the narrow confines of the crust, right? And take a breath of the starry atmosphere and the beyond of our, idea of our humanity, and carry like a whale, right, that breath of the starry, timeless immensity down, down, down into our human experience of this moment. Yeah. And then everything around us is nourished by this breath as we swim in the waking world, the world of the waking mind. Yesterday in the morning, I saw astonishing things, and I can't share all of them right now. Beautiful, tiny phenomenon in light and life. But as I was with a tree who is my friend, and I could see a lot of the tree's sap, and I was just wondering, in the way like a child would wonder, or a comedian, why are trees filled with glue? Why is tree blood gluey? Right? I actually have a little bit right here. Oh, there's the hawk we saw earlier. Oh. There's a reason why it is here in this particular spot. It's looking for someone or something. Yeah. Or the spot's very familiar to it. It's comfortable here. And part of why it might be comfortable is because it's not being harassed by corvids, which, hawks have a pretty rough time in the bird world. They're always being harassed because they eat the babies of other birds. Or actually, I don't really trust the because there. This involves the seemingly true feature of hawks that they eat babies of other birds, but it's not the reason. The reason is quite sophisticated and complex. Or actually, it's just not a reason at all. It's not reasonable. It's meta-reasonable. So many of the things I want to talk about are beyond the ways we usually talk, that I'm inclined to just flip a little switch and go like, I don't mean human, I mean meta-human. I don't mean intelligence, I mean meta-intelligence. It doesn't really work though. Unfortunate. That toy doesn't help much. It can be useful occasionally, but overused, it's a nightmare. It just wrecks stuff. It makes us more blind. Because we're just transferring something we don't understand to another order, and we feel like, well, as long as it's at this order above what we understand, it's okay. There's some usefulness there. But it's also deceptive. When it's merely linguistic, it doesn't work very well. There's mothers with their children here. The universe is replaying itself on little fields of dirt, mountains of sand. Mothering is one of the great underappreciated dimensions of actual human intelligence, right? This is where the stuff that really matters is going on in mothering. I have great reverence for mothers and women in general, and men and animals and plants, but I certainly have special reverence for mothers and women. So yeah, I was wondering why the blood of trees is like glue. And maybe it's more like that when it comes out of the tree and less like that when it's inside the tree. I don't know. But when we fill the vase with something, the vase is not the same, and we are not the same. When we fill the vase with something, we've transformed ourselves too. This is the thing that is difficult to understand. And then if you really want to get difficult, there's no transformation whatsoever, but that's really too difficult. I can't go there very well myself. I'm afraid of that place. So, thank you for joining me on my morning walk and explorations. There's some topics I had in mind that I didn't get to touch on. But like the spider, we can make of our minds traveling threads, capture webs, and even skyhooks, right? Something we can float up into the high terrain of intelligence and then release our position here and just go visit, yeah? The other minds, the other ancient intelligences. Our own minds are made of these in the layers of their anatomy. So it seems to me, and it has been my experience, that all that we imagine to be far away and to require physical travel, though physical travel is interesting, it's not required. The imagination and our minds are equipped for travel in a network unlike anything we've conceived of. And it's a network of incredibly beautiful intelligences, anciently profound, loving, playful, trustworthy, inherently trustworthy. It's down here that we've got trouble, particularly in that crust on top of the mind in which we're stuck. So, I'm reminded of the tar pits, right, in them swallowing the prehistoric mammoths and maybe some dinosaurs and stuff. Perhaps together we can recall and learn all the miraculous mysteries of our deep humanity. This is my hope. This is my dream. Bye-bye for now.